Thank you for joining us for our Communicating Across Culture series. My name is Dr. Amanda McKendree, and I serve as the Arthur F. and Mary J. O'Neill Director of the Fanning Center for Business Communication. I also serve as an associate teaching professor in the Department of Management and Organization within the Mendoza College of Business. I'm delighted to meet with you all today and examine the communication skills critical to enhancing cultural awareness, our knowledge, and our practical skill sets in an increasingly diverse workplace. We are thankful to the many sponsors who have supported our event today, including the Fanning Center for Business Communication, the Mendoza College of Business, Notre Dame International, and the Notre Dame Alumni Association. This programming would not have been possible without each of these entities and their very strong support of our work. Today's discussion is informed by a set of pre-recorded videos that are posted on ThinkND, where one of our guests for today, Professor Jim O'Rourke, discusses a few critical concepts on intercultural communication. Now, if you've not had a chance to review those videos, don't worry, there is no quiz coming your way, and you will have plenty of opportunities to review these videos after today's program. Nearly 500 people have registered for today's session. Some of you may have registered to seek clarity around a problem or challenge that you've identified within your workplace or community. Others may have been inspired by the opportunities that may emerge from a deeper understanding of communication and culture. The current historical moment demands that we all get a little better at this. To discuss these important concepts, I'm excited to welcome my colleague, Professor Jim O'Rourke, Teaching Professor of Management and Notre Dame Class of 1968. We'll also welcome Denise Karkos, Chief Marketing Officer from Sirius XM, who is a Notre Dame alumna from the class of 1993. Welcome, Jim and Denise. For today's program, we'll give a brief overview of culture and communication, along with a few terms and definitions, and then we'll invite you to send along your questions. If you have questions for Jim or Denise, please use the Google form that we are sharing with you now. This will allow us to facilitate the questions as effectively as possible. We will try and answer as many of them as possible given our time together today, but remember, if we don't get to all of them, we do have a private moderated discussion board on LinkedIn to continue the discussion. Now let's turn the program over to my colleague, Jim O'Rourke, a master teacher, expert in corporate reputation, and more recently, an expert of the U.S. Postal Service. Jim?
Thanks, Amanda. I said to a friend, I've been following the revenue and cost structure of the Postal Service for about 15 years, and it didn't become interesting until about a week and a half ago. So it's good to be in the right place at the right time. Well, thanks for the introduction. Welcome, everyone. I see familiar names and familiar faces from around the country and around the campus. Nice to have you here. Both culture and communication are subjects that are as old as humanity itself. And as I've discovered, I think they're really worthy of our time, our consideration, and, if you will, a sincere effort to understand both. Business enterprises, large and small, have learned that a failure to develop, manage, and nurture organizational culture will come at a steep price. And as any number of empirical studies and business cases have shown us, communication is really the centerpiece in managing a lot of that, if not all of it. Part of the problem, of course, when I came to the issue of organizational culture is that I found it a little squishy. It was difficult to define, difficult to get my arms around and figure out. But the longer I look at it, the more I realize this is doable. This is understandable. Organizations have a culture just as societies and nations have a culture, just as places like Portland, Maine, or Santa Fe, New Mexico, or Granger, Indiana, where I'm speaking to you. So let's take a look at this. A couple of definitions first, if you haven't seen the videos. Culture, according to Gary Ferraro, who teaches at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And welcome to my colleague, Tim Flood, who's on the call. Gary Ferraro says culture is everything that people have, think, and do as members of their society. That's pretty broad. So what does it mean? Well, it means that culture is composed of material objects, things we own, things we have, things we might wear, things we might use. It's also composed of ideas, values, attitudes, that is, perspectives on life. And finally, it's composed of expected patterns of behavior, how the rest of our culture expects us to act and behave, and how we actually live up to that. So I have a few principles for you here. You can think about these as we move along. First, all culture is learned. It doesn't come in the DNA, and some of the best examples I have come to me right here from Notre Dame. My dear colleague and wonderful instructor, Yusaku Furuhashi, came to Notre Dame from Japan, of course. He and Mitsu moved to this country and he earned a PhD, and he taught marketing for many, many years at Notre Dame. Denise may even remember Professor Furuhashi. Well, they had two daughters and they look really Japanese. That's unsurprising since both Mitsu and Yusaku are Japanese, right? Though naturalized US citizens. But if you look at, listen to, and talk to those girls, they're as American as Chevrolet, apple pie, and baseball. They speak like Americans, they act like Americans. And of course, when they visit Japan, the locals are baffled. Who are these girls, right? So this is not something that comes in the DNA. It is all learned, and it is universal to human society. The second thing is that cultures are constantly undergoing change. For some, that's encouraging. For others, particularly in perhaps my demographic, it's a little discouraging. If you found a culture you like, you'd kind of like it to stay that way. It won't. Your culture is going to change, like it or not. Some cultures change much more quickly than others. We can explore that. Culture is not value neutral. They are not all equal, just, like jelly beans in a jar. Some of our values will actually clash or conflict with the values of other organizations, other nationalities, other ethnicities. That's workable, but it's something you have to understand as you come in the front door. Not all cultures are equally complex. Some are relatively simple. Some have a lot of moving parts. Two more issues. One, virtually all permit the development of subcultures within that organization. And interestingly, culture can influence biology, while at the same time, biology influences culture. This all applies pretty grandly to societies, organizations, businesses, and individually to each of us. So I think it's important that we gather a little more information, ask questions, and continue the process of learning. So, Denise, wonderful to see you here. First of all, let me fill in a little background on you. You were on the women's soccer team when you guys won the national championship, am I right?
I was unfortunately, I was on the women's soccer team, but I graduated in '93. The '95 team won the national championship. So I was the building years, Jim.
Ooh, you were one of the building blocks. Yeah, well, we could have gotten you into the NBA program so you could still play if you had eligibility. Was it Cindy Dawes who kicked that goal?
Yeah, she was on the team. I can't remember if she's the one who got the winning goal or not.
Oh, that was fantastic. I just thought that was a great moment for Notre Dame, a great moment for women's athletics. Well, Denise, you have been in marketing for many years. You previously were at TD Ameritrade, and you are now at Sirius XM. So I'm wondering if you could just take a couple of minutes, talk about your job and about Sirius, and a little bit about what you think the culture is or ought to be there.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks so much for having me, Jim, and thank you all so much for joining. I think there's kind of two responses to the question, and one is kind of around career development and management, and the other is directly addressing Jim's question of culture. You know, I think when friends saw me jump from 15 years in financial services over to an entertainment company, it felt like a market shift in my path. But that had been absolutely planned. I knew that I loved working for TD, both at the bank and the brokerage, but that, you know, I probably, as I kind of got to be about 50, I realized that I probably had 2 more jobs left in me. And culturally, financial services was not really where I felt like I could make the biggest impact. I loved my years there, but I really wanted to apply everything that I've learned to a culture that is more akin to my passions, which is sports and entertainment. And so I was very planful and talking to recruiters and making sure that the next job, when the time came, would be the right one for me. And so I'm so thrilled to almost be a year now at Sirius XM, and we also bought Pandora. So hopefully we have a lot of listeners here to both of these services. Together, Sirius XM and Pandora serve over 100 million listeners across the US. So the #1 audio entertainment company will be my only plug that it's nice to work for a company with such scale. And the reason I was so excited that Jim talked to me about coming and having this speech, and also one of the reasons that I was welcomed to Sirius XM and Pandora is that they had just come together in September of 2018. And so when I joined in October of 19, you really had 2 incredibly distinct cultures and companies coming together to form one. And because I had been through so many acquisitions in my financial company background, this was something that they saw very appealing. I love leading teams. And so my job became understanding the team I had in Oakland, California, that was managing the Pandora brand, and the team I had in Manhattan managing the Sirius XM brand. How could they come together, or should they stay apart? Should the brands come together, and should they stay apart? And one of the things, Jim, I'm sure we're going to get into is, you know, how do you make those decisions? And from a marketing perspective, to make the call as 2 companies come together, if you want to merge these 2 brands and call them Pandora XM or Sirius XM Pandora, you can't answer that question without first interrogating the culture to make sure if the cultures can't come together, the brands externally certainly cannot. And I'll definitely love to talk to you a little bit more about that.
100 million is a big number. I think if I have 20 students in the classroom, that's a lot. You know, I can't even imagine how managing a user base of 100 million would play out. Certainly, the literature in business says the principal reason for merger and acquisition failure is post-merger integration. It just doesn't get there. You look at Time Warner, you look at Chrysler Daimler, I mean, you can go right down that list and you can say, and those guys didn't see that coming? Come on. Well, I think they thought they could do it. And trying to merge those, I think, is important. One of the issues you just raised is this notion of whether Sirius and Pandora should be separate companies under the same umbrella. And I've had that conversation, and I'll tell you the companies. I had the conversation with the CEO of Macy's, Terry Lundgren, who was of the belief that Macy's should be a branded house. Every department store in the country should be a Macy's. I think he may have come to regret that decision. But as I look at Procter & Gamble, I see a house of brands. I think they have 50 brands that are valued at least $1 billion.
That's right.
And if you want to learn about brand management, P&G is a great place to start. And you really got to look pretty hard. Turn the box over and get your glasses on and look at the small print to find the words Procter & Gamble. They go with Tide or Irish Spring or their particular product brands. So what do you look for as you try to make that decision about integrating a brand? versus leaving them apart. Johnson
Right.
and Johnson in so many ways has left, you know, pharmaceuticals or over-the-counter meds or medical devices as very separately managed brands. What are you looking at?
Sure. So I fundamentally believe that the job of a marketer is that we are only communicating to the public what is reflected internally in the culture. Because when you don't, the experience of the consumer is going to be completely fractured. You can't make a promise in the marketplace and then have the delivery by the front lines be something incongruent with that promise. And so for me to answer the question of should Pandora and Sirius XM come together, and by the way, there was so much pent-up demand. The actual closure of the company's acquisition happened in April of 19, and they waited until I started in October to answer the question. And people didn't know how to sign their email signatures or what should be on the letterhead. So fundamental tactical answers were needed. And what I did was I started with a framework that laid out what is the company vision, what are our values across both brands, and then go from there in terms of what is the value proposition that we're offering, what is the unmet need we're meeting in the marketplace, who is the target audience, and how are we strategically differentiating ourselves in the marketplace, and how does that culminate in an external position. So having a framework that we work to put together to answer those questions, I socialized the framework across both companies. I worked really hard with HR and in our research teams to really get as much existing information as I could to really cascade that plan. And what it unveiled was that the companies had done the hard work of unifying the vision and the values. So that was one consistency across Sirius XM and Pandora. When they began to merge, they recognized, they put their values up on the wall, they put their vision, and there was so much intersection. It was not that hard of a task to come up with one unifying statement. But really, after I, on my framework, got to the vision and values and understood culturally how, what we're espousing to be, it all separated from there. Pandora is mostly a free service. 90% of our listeners are on an ad-supported free tier. So it's a very democratized, accessible platform where people are largely consuming music. And largely the age demographic is 25 plus. If you go to Sirius XM, it is a paid subscription. And our average age is about 58 years old. So it's an expensive subscription that meets the needs of an older demographic. And so from that perspective, you start to see how we are competing in the marketplace. Sirius XM in the car, it's really competing against AM, FM radio. Pandora is competing against Spotify. So the decision wasn't that hard to say that, at least for the short term, for the next 2 years, these brands should be separate. But to me, it really starts with the culture. And so the cultures, while have the same vision and values, we're still integrating. We're still getting to know each other. We're on both coasts. There's a lot to overcome. And so that's where I see my focus to really be, is to make sure that we're all aiming towards the same goals and objectives, so that when we come together as one culturally, it becomes easier to then come together as one brand.
We'll talk about the elements of culture here in a bit, but there's still a couple of brands that come to mind. Were there any lessons there for you from Reed Hastings and what he tried at Netflix? You may remember famously, he had a service that rented videos on cassette, and that was most of his revenue. But then he had this streaming service. So he started up Quickster. And the first thing he did was make people open 2 accounts. He doubled the cost of the service, 2 passwords, by the way. And unsurprisingly, most of the human race hated him for the next 6 or 8 months. He apologized and said, oh, yeah, I shouldn't have done that. So are there cautionary tales out there about running a subscription service and a free service?
Yeah, so in I would say 90% of people's minds, they don't know that these 2 brands have come together. And, this predates me that, that was a decision made, that there was no campaign out there to say that Pandora and SiriusXM are one. So only in the analyst community is that really a known entity. So in the consumer's minds, we're serving two different jobs, and it's not a similar scenario as to the Netflix Reed Hastings days. Where I do take a page out of that lesson from Netflix is we have a wildly enduring business model for SiriusXM in the car. 85% of the cars that come off the line come with a free trial for SiriusXM. And you then subscribe at the end of that trial, but that 3-month period is trying to build that behavior, get you to listen to Hits One or Howard Stern or Andy Cohen or Jenny McCarthy, and trying to build those habits. It's all about habit forming. And that is what we try to do. And it's a really strong business model. But as we all know, when your kids get in the car, they're plugging in their phone and they're putting Spotify on. And so we have threats to that business model. And so much like Netflix, instead of trying to monetize the heck out of the situation, we're diversifying our options. And so we do have a SiriusXM streaming app, and we're trying to build an audience around there. And when you think back to my framework, we actually are adding kind of a third column, because we're finding that we have a lot younger of a demographic, as you can imagine, coming to just stream SiriusXM on their app. They don't find utility in the car, but they like a less expensive version that they can get on their phone. So we've got now, and we just bought Stitcher, which is a podcast company. So we are kind of leaning into the house of brands concept. But I see my job right now, in the current day, as managing 3 experiences. And it's SiriusXM in the car, it's SiriusXM streaming, and it's Pandora streaming.
It's interesting. If I could move into the organization now, some years ago, Notre Dame used to run a program for Bayer Corporation. They're about 25% of Bayer Gesellschaft. They're headquartered in Pittsburgh, but they put high promise managers through a program at Notre Dame. And the first thing I noticed is that in logoed clothing, and congratulations, by the way, on the alumni ND quarter zip. I like that. In the logoed clothing, there were no 2 guys in the room who were wearing the same brand. They all were Bayer employees, but they worked for Miles Laboratory, Cutter Biological, Harman and Reimer, and on it went. There must have been nearly 20 different brands under the Bayer Corporation umbrella. And I had a long conversation with the CEO, and this was to him a really, really difficult issue. He finally decided on his own, unilaterally, he said, well, I've had enough of this. I take away now all of your clothing that says something else. And he said, and he did it at Notre Dame. He brought everybody in the room. He said, bring to me your caps and your shirts and the sweatpants and everything, and I give you something new. And so they thought they were getting replacement clothing. What they got were Bayer products, kind of cool green and blue, and the Bayer cross that he had just retrieved from Sterling Pharmaceutical. And I asked what he paid for Sterling Pharmaceutical, and it was about $3.2 billion. And I said, I think you overpaid for that. And he said, yeah, that'll be a C. And so for him, branding the whole corporation, giving every employee the same colors, the same trade dress, the same logo type, he said will have a huge effect on their belonging. As it happens, he was right. I don't think that's happened everywhere, but does that sort of thing concern you about people within the organization feeling as though they're part of something that's the same as every other employee? You are muted, Denise. There you go.
I'm unmuted now. I was trying. Sorry, I muted myself because there's some noise in my backyard. So while you were talking, I didn't want that to be distracting. So I will not do that anymore. Yeah. So I think that well, now I'm losing my train of thought from the construction going on. Sorry.
Well, it's this notion of everybody wearing the same
Oh,
colors,
right,
or
same
feeling
clothing.
like they're all
Yeah,
part of the
the
same
bear
outfit.
example. Thank you. So yeah, so I think the easy answer is that we all work for SiriusXM. That is the easiest. There's a master brand in this equation. It is SiriusXM. The executive leadership team, all but one person is legacy SiriusXM. So that's not a surprise to anybody. The nuance is the pride. There is, and I'd say two things. The pride that the Pandora associates have in having built this brand and having, tens of millions of users listening to the product that they created. I don't want that to ever be lost. And so, Pandora t-shirts and Pandora hoodies. I mean, everybody wears Pandora in that Oakland, California office. Back in the day when that was actually a reality. And then likewise, our SiriusXM, wildly tenured population, and they're so proud of the satellites they put up into space. And they were the ones that did that. So the pride is really distinct to the legacy companies, and it's too soon to remove that from the equation. And there's not really a need. It's not lost on anybody that we all work for SiriusXM. And again, it's led by legacy SiriusXM folks, so we know how to be successful as an employee. The only other thing I'd say is that, one of the things that I continue to, reflect upon is the complexity of this company. Mm. There are people who are, for Pandora, we sell advertising. And so we have an incredible ad sales team that are out liaising with media buyers and advertising agencies. They want their business card to be Pandora. That's what they're selling. There is no advertising on SiriusXM. So you actually don't want that brand affiliated with that group. Likewise, back to my satellite and my car dealership analogy, we have people who are in Detroit and they're talking to GM and Ford and a whole other group of astrophysicists who literally have 2 satellites in space and working with SpaceX to launch a third. That Pandora doesn't have any of those attributes. So for now, we will continue to embrace the individuality because it's not as complex as a bear. We've got 2 for now, but everybody knows who they work for, and that's SiriusXM.
Well, let's talk about something a little more subtle. For a long time, it was very popular in large and complex organizations to bring in consultants, and they would help you draft a statement of vision, values, and beliefs. And then those would be hung on the wall in the boardroom like a talisman to ward off evil spirits. But there was no real commitment on the part of the company to do anything about it. They said, well, we ticked that box, we're moving on, right? But I think in recent days, particularly with the movement around social justice, the movement that demonstrates our society is at an inflection point in which it's changing. And I'll add one more thing. Trust in business has actually ticked up, if you ask Richard Edelman. They trust business more than they trust government. It's not that they trust them a lot, it's just that they trust them more than they trust government. And a lot of people are saying, the government's not doing anything about this, it's up to you, private enterprise. You have the assets, you have the organization, you have the muscle and the mind and the manpower to get something done. So what in your organization do you think about vision, values? And vision is more sort of about who you want to be, but about values, inclusion or diversity or whatever else. Do you think about that, and how does it affect the way you go to market?
Yeah, I think when I got here, there were so many things I wanted to accomplish. In one of the threads culturally was that Pandora really focused a lot on the customer experience in the app. And so we're constant conversations with consumers about features and benefits that they could offer. So very customer centric. And not to say that SiriusXM is not, it's just that we have a built-in business model where your product is served up in the car, and it's just different. And so if anyone has been a victim of our direct marketing strategy, I apologize, because for those people who don't take our trial and subscribe, we have a very profitable marketing tactic, which is to send good old-fashioned direct mail and try to convert you. And it's wildly effective. We use a lot of offers. But what does that do? That breeds distrust, because if you don't take us up on one offer, we're going to give you another offer and then another offer. And it's also, you know, delivered in a bit of an old-fashioned way. So my desire was to modernize our approach to marketing on the SiriusXM side, to have a customer first lens so that we weren't alarming you with what looked like a service notice, but in fact was an upsell offer, and really flip that around. First I'll take COVID, and then I'll take your D&I point. So for COVID, what happened was we have call centers in the Philippines and in India, and those were some of the first countries to shut down due to the pandemic. And so we lost our ability to take phone calls. And what that forced us to do was to actually implement some of those customer-centric tasks, which are the ability to cancel your subscription online, where we typically would have them go to a call center where 80% of the people would actually just go to a lesser expensive subscription versus just wholesale cancel. But giving the power back to the consumer digitally to say, you can go online, change your subscription, cancel it, and empower them to make a decision rather than having our marketing machine. That was a huge win that probably wouldn't have happened for a while until I could build influence in the organization. And it happened quickly because of the need. And that will remain now. Your point about D&I was the other kind of catalyst to a cultural shift that we are making. And the wonderful thing about SiriusXM and Pandora is that we truly live the mantra of diversity and inclusion makes the whole company better, more profitable. It's a real business imperative. But the risk of having the words on the wall and not the meat on the bone in an action-oriented way, what the George Floyd incident did and what all of this social unrest has done is it had a groundswell of 5,000 employees across these two brands demanding of management to show more action. Again, we're already doing really well. We're a very diverse and inclusive culture. But when they looked up and they looked at our board of directors and they looked at our senior management team, all white. And so what our management did, what our CEO did, was to come at that head on and say, we're good, and we've been proud of the progress we've made, but we're not where we need to be. And this is the moment that we have. And I'm going to take, the time to do it right. And we, quickly put a Black woman on our board of directors. And we have been diversifying our leadership team. And from a brand perspective, we absolutely have been very much more diverse and inclusive in the communications that we put out there. So again, it accelerated an agenda. And one of the things, Jim, I know that you have been, curious about is like who should own kind of culture. And when I think about things like diversity and inclusion, when I think about culture, everybody looks up to the executive team, and that's really where their belief systems will lie. Because if they're not living the values, if they're not, a diverse group, then everything else is just, to your point, the talisman, the poster on the wall. So what I'm incredibly proud of, who I think should own kind of culture, it should be the executive team, because it's not about communications when it comes to that. It's about communications as a critical point. It is about demonstrating action. And I think that's what's happening in 2020. I think that it's been such a year of unrest on so many fronts that we have to build trust. We have to put our actions behind our words. And that's certainly happening at our company.
I think about the words of Arthur Page, who was the comms chief at AT&T from 1927 to 1949. He had these principles, and the first three were, 1, tell the truth, 2, prove it with action, and then 3, listen to the customer. and on it went. But the whole notion, he said, of who you are is 90% doing something and 10% talking about it. And I sort of like that approach. One of the things I say to my students who worry constantly about a job, back in the old days, it would be that you'd have been through a number of interviews and you'd have gotten some offers and you would have a job by Thanksgiving. And I said, well, that makes Thanksgiving dinner more pleasant, doesn't it? And they'd all say, oh, yeah, yeah, I don't want to come home at Christmas still looking for work. And I know it's going to be a lot harder this year. I know that. But I tell them, don't just take an offer because it's an offer. Now, you may have to do that in the long run if it's the only offer you got. But I tell them, honestly, an organization is not going to change its values to suit you. Changing your values to suit them is going to be painful. So you got to get on the right horse to begin with. So I know you're not in human resources, but how do you portray yourself, let's say, to prospective employees, to people you're hoping to bring on board? How do you describe this as a place to work?
Yeah. So I actually spent a lot of time. I had 2 calls this morning with friends of kids coming out of college. I think we can't do that enough. Pay it all back for the people who paved the way for you. And so I talk to college students all the time. And I don't have children of my own, so it's also good to kind of keep me apprised of the stress and the burden and that these kids are under. I don't think I was ever that stressed in my life. Today coming out of school. So, you know, I have a companion point that I make to yours, Jim, but I will first address this, you know, how I want to show up and show people that, you know, an executive with a C title isn't the stereotype you have in your head, at least not with me. And by the way, it will be with others. You're going to encounter, you know, that kind of stoic, you know, business person wearing the suit and all that. That's going to be hard to access. But you also are going to have people like me who are going to roll up their sleeves and throw back a beer and have a conversation with you and be raw and be vulnerable. And throughout my career, it's funny, anytime I get up and present on stage or do any of that, I always look at how I'm showing up versus other chief marketing officers. And it is a little different. My polish may not be as there. I may not be as buzzwordy. And I've always wondered, is that going to hurt me? And what I think what the days that we're living in now has done to me is it's actually benefited me because I just am exactly who I am off, you know, the clock as I am on the clock. Like I'm not 2 people. And I think now having everyone watching you in your home operating 24 hours a day, I think that's really the authenticity has benefited me. So I think, you know, Jim, what I do and what I encourage, you know, my peers and my team to do is just be authentic to who you are, because it's a heck of a lot of work to do the opposite. And I think that's old school thinking. So just be a genuine, authentic leader. I actually, I have about a little over 200 people on my team, but I do a weekly call with, you know, on Zoom with all of them and just give them information, constant communication, because there's such trepidation right now. But I'm complementing that with individual calls, you know, just even if it's 10 minutes, just to get to know their friends and families. I started in October and I came back to Maine. That was the Portland, Maine reference at Jim's opening, to my home in March. So I don't know everybody. And so I want to build that chemistry and that relationship with them. So I will always bring that element with me, no matter what company I go in. And at this company, it's widely embraced. So people are now doing weekly Zooms and things like that because they see the efficacy of it. I get a 90% show rate every week, and I've been doing it since March 17th. So I think that's an important part. So yeah, I mean, I think that's how I want to show up.
200 is a big number. Yeah, I would have to write their names down. I don't think I could remember all of them. Well, it's about 18, 19 minutes before the hour. Let me ask Amanda if we're ready to take questions yet from our guests online. I think it's probably time. Do you have questions to pass along? And why don't we try a couple of those?
I'm muted. Thank you. Okay, we do have a few questions, and they've fallen into a few different categories here. The first question is in the category of planning, anticipating, and managing change. And the question is, sometimes the combination of cultures, creating that winning culture is very unique to a point in time. And how do you overcome or avoid the mistake some companies make of trying to take lightning in a bottle and replicating that non-organically?
Great. I think that honesty has to be like front and center. So what happened with the George Floyd moment in time was just an outcry of everything that wasn't happening versus a celebration of what had been achieved. And we as a leadership team recognized this isn't a time to give ourselves a pat on the back to say, we actually do have a diverse workforce. We do have a diverse brand and how we show up in the marketplace, because no one wants to hear that. People are upset. They want honesty. So, I believe that the number one rule of thumb is to be vulnerable and raw and honest. And so that's how our leadership team showed up. And they said, we're not good enough. And here's our action plan to get there. So for moments in time, it's all about listening, being open, making sure as many people have a voice at the table, resisting the urge to defend, and absolutely leaning into the work to be done. And I hope this is getting at the heart of the question, but that to me is how you can build belief at pivotal times in culture, and we are in it right now.
Well, it is true that change is inexorable. And I tell my students that one of the privileges I had as a younger man was living across the lawn from the chambers occupied by Charles Darwin at Christ College, Cambridge. And I saw in his own hand, on a draft of his magnus opus on the origin of species by means of natural selection, he wrote, "Survival falls not to the fittest of creatures, nor to the most intelligent, but to those best adapted for change." And so as you think about that, it could be a mantra for business. How are we geared up for change? Because what worked a year or 5 or 10 years ago is obviously not going to work 5 or 10 years from now. How do we get ahead of that curve? Do you have a team that plans for change?
No, we've tried to implement change management teams in past jobs, but I have been wildly unsuccessful in having that as a discrete function that could add value. I think, I think the biggest lesson that I learned is like, I'm great with change, but I also have a little bit of like security and tenure under my belt to have the stamina for that. I always have to check myself to say that, majority of people are not okay with change, and how do I really show up in those moments? And I run the risk of being cavalier to change because I'm so comfortable with it. And so for me, it's very much being self-aware of how I make sure I show up for others and not based on my own comfort zone.
Sure. So Amanda, other questions from our viewers?
Yes, we do have one question, and it actually is a nice connection to some points that Denise was making earlier with the previous question. And this is asking her to extend her comments from business cultures to the larger and more personally urgent social context. And then a few examples here: white culture with Black culture, especially when two cultures are in an uneven power dynamic. Likewise, what about gender-defined business cultures, male-dominated cultures setting expectations for how some businesses or industries are run?
From a race perspective, I would say that it's so hard for me as a leader to show up authentically, being kind of privileged white person. And so what I have done is to show up and say that we're going to have an imperfect conversation. I'm going to be here and try, and I'm talking to everyone that I can talk to make sure that I'm more in tune with all sorts of diverse talent, and that I'm committed to the next hire I make at my leadership table will diversify my table. And I will kind of read everything that I possibly can. And so, outside of business, I think, for me personally, it's about, specifically when it comes to what's happening from a race perspective, is I thought I was an evolved creature, and I'm not. And so recognizing that and investing in this conversation so I can show up as a leader that people can trust is wildly important. And then, the gender part of the equation, I've been in male-dominated industries, from financial services to, Sirius is fairly male-dominated as well. All I can say is that, and I'll thread the needle on both of these points, all we can do is commit to constantly having a view of having culture adds. I love this narrative someone taught me. Don't say, are they going to be a good cultural fit for a company? Will they be a cultural add to the company? And I think how you change cultures over time is if you have that mindset. So how do you bring more women into the C-suite? How do you bring more Black people into the C-suite? How do you make that happen? You do it by having cultural additive wins on the board. Like, that's what we need to do. So for me, and I'll give a little bit more, I'm way more conversant in the gender, kind of gap and the inequality there, but much more from a how to overcome it than a having some philosophical viewpoint as to how to change it, other than what I've said. And for me, I think that if you're working in male-dominated industries, what I have found to be not as successful is women banding together to have conversations about women, with women, about how to be successful in male-dominated cultures. I'm very passionate about, if you're working in a male-dominated industry, then you have to be inclusive in that conversation and have the women and the men problem solve together about how to get more women to the C-suite. Every time I do that, I see change. And otherwise, it turns into just a microcosm, a small group of people talking to themselves, and it doesn't evolve. So for me, I'm very passionate about bringing men into the gender conversation for the solution, rather than having this polarizing conversation. I don't think that's as effective.
It occurs to me, and you and I have not talked about this, but one of the things that I learned repeatedly as an Air Force officer, 20 years, I got permanent change of station orders right along the way, and so was one air base after another. And at every one of those air bases, there was a standardized onboarding process in which you were welcomed into the organization and in which you learned about things that were going to be important to your particular occupational specialty or what we did at this wing or that squadron. But there were also bigger issues about who we were and how we fit into the big picture. Do you have a specific onboarding process in which you welcome people and you say, here's who we are and here's how you fit in?
Yeah, we do, and we're pretty prescriptive about it because we have some really charismatic leaders that have to show up every single time groups of people are being onboarded, because not everybody is as involved as a leader at our leadership table. We've got great leaders, but they have different strengths. But from an onboarding perspective, just like the consumer journey, if they're going to download Pandora, those first few days are mighty important to create the passion and the love. And just like employees, those are vital first days to make that impression. And so, we make sure that, the leaders that show up for those conversations are showing not only the passion for the organization, but also everything we've talked about around, showing the numbers of diversity. Here's what my team looks like. Here's the percentages. We show everything. And that's what I love about this company. And it's funny because it's a very self-aware culture, and I knew it in my interview because when I met with the CEO, at the end of my interview, he said to me, "This company rejects new tissue." And I was like, "Well, that didn't go."
Say that again.
He said, "This company rejects new tissue."
Oh.
Well, that interview probably didn't go so well, if that's what he's ending on. But what he meant was that it's a high bar to get indoctrinated into the culture, and only come if you're ready. And I loved that line because I came in knowing that my first order of business was building relationships across, across both brands, so that I could build trust and relationships and make sure that in my onboarding that I was leaning into everybody so that they weren't going to reject this new tissue. And so it's been a really great way. And again, as an extrovert, it's easy for me to make sure that I'm building those relationships and influence.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things we realize is that everybody in the organization doesn't have the same preferences, same work style. It's difficult to integrate all that. So Amanda, do we have another question, or perhaps two? We've got about 8 minutes.
We do. We have 3 questions remaining here, but very similar in theme, still focused on managing change. The first part of it, how do you juggle elements of change and consistency? And then how do you deal with resistance to change? And specifically, some tactics here that might be helpful for bringing people over to your side of the issue.
Okay, well, I can help at some point, but Denise, I'm really interested in how you're approaching this.
Yeah, so I'll talk to you about my, what I've done in my first kind of 11 months, which is I have 2 different teams, one from Pandora, one from Sirius in terms of my direct reports. And what I did was I quickly espoused to them my marketing philosophy. And that is that to be a modern marketer, you have to be accountable to driving business growth. This isn't about soft metrics around growing a brand and you'll see the payback in 4 years. We have way too much sophistication in our craft these days to not be accountable to driving true revenue growth for a company. And for them to hear me constantly talking about that is how we're showing up as a leadership team, and consistently beating that drum at the highest level. Every conversation from there cascades down to it. Remember, we said that this is our goal, to be seen as enterprise growth drivers. And if everything can ladder back to that statement, so all my actions, all my requests, all my pushing and urging ladders up to that, they see the vision and they believe in it and buy into it. And so for those of them, then it cascades down to, let's take one person in particular that may not be comfortable with, I don't even know how to calculate EBITDA and revenue, and it's not a language I speak. My philosophy is have honest conversations and then say, I'm going to stack the deck with you. I'll team you up with people. I'll give you a new hire to put next to you with those skills, because the vision's not going to change. If you feel insecure about the capability, we can solve for that. If you feel reticent that you're not going to buy it, if you fundamentally disagree that marketers shouldn't be accountable, that's a totally different set of conversations. Those are the, again, back in the non-COVID days, those are the conversations where it's like, if you're not buying into that, okay, well, let's go to dinner, let's have a glass of wine, and let's talk about how you could be successful here and how you may not be successful here. I just think transparency, even if it's the dark side of things, is paramount. So for me, to get people understand the vision, every conversation has to cascade to that vision. And if people feel insecure, incapable, make room for that honest conversation and then stack the deck against them to make them successful. Because they're buying in, they just don't know how to do it. And that's my job as a leader.
That really sounds good. I would offer a phrase that may fit in there somewhere, and it has to do with reducing uncertainty. What does the market not like? Uncertainty. And when markets go crazy and you see this real volatility, what's driving it? They don't know what's going to happen. If you have a path forward, if you know what the rules of the game are, people feel a lot better about that. My friend Susan Hoff, who was the chief communication officer at Best Buy for a number of years, said one day a fellow whom she knew who was working up in the front office came to her and said, the board has just decided that we're going to transition all of our IT team to Accenture. They'll still come to work every day, wear the blue shirt and have the name tag around the neck says Best Buy, but they'll be Accenture employees. And Susan said, well, when's that happen? He said, next week. And she said, count me out. And he said, what do you mean? It's your job to tell them. She said, no, that would be your job. I'm not getting involved here. He said, well, you have to. So she said, look, you're going to lose most of those folks. They'll go into a panic. And the ones you really don't want to lose are your very best people. The ones who will be left are the ones you're trying to get rid of, actually. So she said, give me a year. And he went back to the board, and then they brought her in, and she got the year. But she spent the year in brown bag meetings and with print products and with short form video and a variety of ways, town hall meetings, and sometimes just seminars. Her whole goal was just to reduce uncertainty. There weren't a lot of moving parts. You know, you're still going to get paid, you're still going to have insurance, all that. But anxiety and sometimes rash moves, jumping to another company, is driven by that uncertainty. So she said, the one way I know of to deal with change is to make sure everybody knows everything they need to know. And she interestingly said, make sure it's actually true. Then they can make an informed decision about whether this is a good place to work. So, you know, my sense is that that's the circumstance you're in, trying as transparently as you can to share all that you know.
That's exactly right. And you know, I just reorganized the entire team of 200, and it took me a long time because I did it my way, which is no one's going to be surprised, and that's hard when you're reorganizing, you're merging two teams. But you know, when I announced it, I did it in a way that it was my leadership team and I who had fundamental changes to their jobs together announcing it as 8 people. And it's not just from me on high, because I'm still a stranger, right? I'm still not even a year in. So it was really important for the people who had their teams listening to these words. They weren't just my words. Very critical to take the time to do it right.
Okay, so we got about 2 minutes. Amanda, is there anything we haven't covered or talked about?
I think our best job that we could do right now is to thank our participants for joining us, and certainly thanking Denise for sharing her expertise and you, Jim, for sharing your insights. We will meet again in 2 weeks for part 2 of our series. You can check out Jim's videos on ThinkND for some short explanations of what we will be covering. Our next guest will be Chris Murphy, Vice President and Deputy Chief Communications Officer from AT&T. We look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the day. Stay safe.